Hi again, everybody. This is Mark Movsesian. I'm the director of the Mattone Center for Law and Religion at St. John's Law School in New York, and this is another episode of Legal Spirits, our podcast series on cases and issues in law and religion. You can find past episodes archived on our website, lawandreligionforum.org, and also on streaming platforms like Apple iTunes and Spotify and Android. We encourage you, if you like us, to subscribe so that you'll be notified as new content becomes available. Well, our guest today on the podcast is Kelsey Dallas, who is the assistant managing editor of the Deseret News, where she covers religion, sports, and the Supreme Court. I'm going to ask about that in just a second. Kelsey is one of the most interesting religion journalists writing today, and she's joined us on Legal Spirits before, and I'm delighted to have her back. So, Kelsey, welcome.
Thanks so much. I am happy to be here.
So, Kelsey, before we get into the episode, I have to ask about your beat, which I think must be the broadest in American journalism. This is religion, sports, and the Supreme Court. So, how did that happen?
Well, I shouldn't pretend that it really makes sense. Basically, I'm being spoiled by editors who are happy to indulge my interest in sports, but I've tried to connect it to my work on religion by doing quite a few stories about what athletes have said about their faith, how faith related conflict sometimes comes up in the sports context. And finding these connection points that not everybody has seen. So it's a similar approach to sports as I have taken and continue to take with the Supreme Court, where you really zoom in on the religious elements of the day's news.
That's interesting. So, I mean, I sometimes think when I'm on social media and I'm reading Twitter or things, people treat the Supreme Court like it's a sports event. I mean, who's up and who's down and who's going to write the next opinion. But so yours isn't quite like that. It's more actually religion is the overarching theme in all of your journalism.
Yes, but I should say that because of people's general interest in sports and the way that we think of sports as a lens through which we see the rest of the world, that was why I was kind of attracted to covering more sports, is that it's a broader audience to work with and a broader audience to talk about religion with than just the people who are following the Supreme Court closely or following religion news closely. Now I feel like I can connect with readers of all types.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, good luck. I mean, I think it must be unique, right, Kelsey? Is there anyone else who has that beat?
I think there are many religion reporters who have an interest in sports and dip into it from time to time. There are many sports reporters who touch on religion. So the example I often bring up is when Mina Kimes at ESPN profiled quarterback Aaron Rodgers. The story ended up being quite a bit about his beliefs. I think he's agnostic. Like, he talked quite a bit about his thinking along religious lines. So people dip in and out of this, but I think I might be the only one who set up shop and said, I want to live at the corner of religion and sports.
Well, that's fantastic. It's really interesting. That's great. Well, good for you, and good luck with all of that. So, listeners, Kelsey had a really interesting column last month that came across my computer screen, and the column is about a dispute between the National Park Service, which is a branch of the federal government, and the Knights of Columbus, which of course is a Catholic fraternal organization. And the dispute was about the Knights' request to continue celebrating a Memorial Day Mass at the Poplar Grove National Cemetery in Petersburg, Virginia. And the Park Service briefly denied the Knights of Columbus permission to I mean, technically, I think, Kelsey, they said the Knights could celebrate Mass in a quote unquote First Amendment zone outside this. Was that in the parking lot somewhere?
I think it was just outside the cemetery's fence, sort of a demonstration space, a free speech zone, as they're called on college campuses.
I see. Okay, so they could be right outside the fence, but they couldn't be in the cemetery. And the Knights alleged that that denial violated their religious freedom under a federal statute called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, and also the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. And Kelsey, we're going to get into all the details. I gather they were able to patch something up at the end and the Mass went forward. But what I find interesting about this case is that it happened at all. So why would the Park Service decide to object now when the Knights have been celebrating a Mass at Poplar Groves on Memorial Day for decades? And also, what does this dispute reveal about the state of law and religion in the U.S. today? That's the kind of thing I want to talk about.
The Knights were similarly befuddled, the Knights and their attorneys, because, as you noted, they had been holding Memorial Day masses or Memorial Day worship services in this cemetery for most years since the 1960s, as far back as members could remember. And so their question was, why is this suddenly a problem? And park officials weren't very straightforward with their explanation. The most they would provide in terms of an explanation for denying an event permit was a 2022 policy update on what types of events were allowed on Park Service land. And basically, the concern, at least as it's spelled out in that 2022 policy, is that the National Park Service should not allow events that could be seen as demonstrations or that would gather a large crowd that could be disruptive. And the Knights were taken aback by that, because to them they're holding a quiet, solemn affair honoring veterans, and they're not meaning at all to cause a disturbance.
Right. Well, I'm going to get into that with you. I mean, apparently, as far as I know from the record, there never was a complaint about the Knights of Columbus disrupting anything or blocking someone from getting to Actually, we should say the gravesite, I think, goes back to the Civil War. I think this is from the Battle of Petersburg in Virginia. So I don't know how many people is it still being used to bury people? I don't know, but it's a historic cemetery.
It's a historic cemetery, and they thought of what they were doing, this Memorial Day Mass, as a historic event. As you noted, it had taken place for many, many years, many decades, and it was an active religious service, but it was also honoring their own predecessor knights activity. That this is just part of what it means to be part of the Knights of Columbus, is to hold these Memorial Day services.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so let's talk about this regulation that you mentioned. So the Park Service said we have these regulations, and I guess in 2022 there was a new interpretation or updating of them. And the regulations prohibit quote unquote demonstrations at national cemeteries. And they're defined, that is, a demonstration is defined in the regulations as, quote, a demonstration, which is a bit redundant. Some lawyer wasn't doing his or her job there. Okay. A demonstration, picketing, speech making, marching, holding a vigil or religious service, or any like form of conduct that involves the communication or expression of views or grievances, the conduct of which is reasonably likely to attract a crowd of onlookers. And that's just what you said, that they didn't want disruptions. They didn't want a lot of, I don't know, busybodies or just people. They didn't want a lot of people around that could detract from the solemnity of the cemetery. I guess that's what they're trying to say. That's pretty expansive, but the regulations also allow, there's an exception for, quote, official commemorative events
Hmm.
conducted for Memorial Day and other dates designated by the superintendent as having special historic and commemorative significance to a particular national cemetery, which I gather from what you say, Kelsey, is just what the Knights said they were trying to do.
Yes, they were frustrated by the way that the policy was being applied in a couple of different ways, but I think the most essential was that they felt like they should never have fit the definition of a demonstration, because it was a small gathering of knights. It was not a public facing, oh, all sorts of onlookers are going to gather. We're going to bring all of Petersburg together of this. No, it was a pretty solemn, small gathering. But another piece of it that they were frustrated by and outlined in a letter that they sent to the National Park Service is that they felt like this should fit in that exemption for a historic, long standing, important gathering, important to the history of that area. And I wrote a piece originally that wasn't so specific to this one conflict, that was more about how historic efforts to honor veterans have often fueled religious freedom conflict unexpectedly, because they exist in this strange space between long time honoring and then actively faith-based today. So I
Yeah.
mentioned in that story the Bladensburg Cross Supreme Court case, talking about how eventually the Supreme Court in that case said that the government could continue to pay for the upkeep of the Bladensburg Cross because it was religious and secular at the same time, in an interesting way.
No, that I was thinking of that too, and the Bladensburg Cross case, the American Legion case, is like this in a sense. Of course, you might think, and maybe bring you back to discuss that case. You might think it's sort of artificial in a way to say we can very strictly distinguish between something that is faith based today and something that is simply a historical tradition, because most religious ceremonies involve a historical commemoration doing something the way it's been done in the past. So that's interesting.
I'm fascinated by this because there are certain holidays that people go through the motions of faith, even if they're not actively religious themselves, that it just feels appropriate to do something solemn and to think about something bigger than yourself. That's not what the Knights are up to here. The Knights really do believe that this is a Catholic ceremony that they are taking part in, but that's where it feels like conflict that arises out of faith based efforts to honor veterans misunderstands what's taking place in many cases. It's like, yes, it is religious, but it's also just honoring veterans.
Right, it's both. Yeah, that's very interesting. So the Knights argued here that excluding them from the cemetery violated their rights under two different legal regimes or two different legal texts. One is a statute that's called RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the other is the Free Exercise. Let's start with RFRA. I think that's the stronger argument, and they did too because in their letter that's what they went with first. So the lawyers obviously thought that was the stronger argument too. So under RFRA, the federal government cannot substantially burden a person's exercise of religion unless the government shows it has a compelling reason for applying the rule to that person and that the government has chosen the least restrictive means. And unlike the free exercise clause, which we'll talk about in just a second, there's no sense that this, if it's a general rule, if it's a neutral rule, that's okay. You get no religious accommodation. Under RFRA, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's a neutral rule or a generally applicable rule. And listeners, in some ways, we've talked about this before. RFRA reinstates the so-called strict scrutiny test that the court moved away from in a case called Employment Division versus Smith in 1990. So, Kelsey, what was the Knights' argument under RFRA? Why did they say that this was a substantial burden on the exercise of their religion? That is, that they had to be in the cemetery, they couldn't be in that First Amendment zone or free speech zone that you mentioned before.
That was the most interesting detail I turned up in my interview with the Knight's attorney, that they perform a blessing on Memorial Day that's actually called a blessing for in the cemetery on Memorial Day in the cemetery. And so they felt that it was inappropriate to do that blessing from outside the cemetery. That was the argument that they were making in terms of the substantial burden, is that these Knights felt as if their prayers and the service as a whole did not mean as much if it was needing to take place somewhere else. I think that there's also an important argument about what the government's interest is here, because there had been decades of these services taking place, and then okay, a policy change, now the event permit is denied in 2023 and then again in 2024. What happened between 2022 and 2023 that suddenly the government has a compelling interest to make sure that this doesn't take place in the cemetery? That was what the Knights were trying to figure out, and I think that that's where the RFRA argument would have been very compelling.
Yeah, so okay, even assuming this is a substantial burden, and courts tend to be very deferential
Mhm.
about whether there's a burden on someone's religion, the Knights argued, I think it was a good argument, that what is the compelling interest here? We've done this for decades. And in addition, there's been no one protesting. And in addition to that, you have this exception, which says that for official commemorative events conducted for Memorial Day, there's an exception for those. Those are allowed if the superintendent says, yes, we can have that there. So, I mean, they would be just as disruptive as the Knights, I would think, right, Kelsey?
Yes, the attorney I interviewed was saying that he felt it was a ridiculous situation when you wouldn't be allowed to hold a Memorial Day mass, but you would be allowed to hold an interpretation of a past Memorial Day mass. That you could reenact a service that had taken place in 1966, but you couldn't have a new one in 2024. And so those were the arguments they were preparing to make if this had moved forward.
Yeah, and also look, if the government is saying, okay, we have a compelling interest in preserving the solemnity of a cemetery, that makes perfect sense. That's a genuine interest. One has to understand that, even if it is a Civil War cemetery where there are probably not that many people going to see gravesites of loved ones because it happened so long ago. But why is an official commemoration going to be any less of a crowd of onlookers destroying the solemnity? Why is that any different from this? I mean, if there's a compelling governmental interest, they shouldn't allow those things either. And so I think that was a pretty strong argument. I thought, and perhaps that's why they settled this case. We'll get to that in just a second. But the other argument the Knights made they made an argument in the alternative, was that the exclusion of the Knights of Columbus from the cemetery violated the Knights' First Amendment rights under the Free Exercise Clause, which guarantees the free exercise of religion. And here, I think their argument was a bit weaker, although I go back and forth on this. But so listeners, here's the background. I mentioned this case called Employment Division versus Smith a little while ago, and that's a case from 1990, which kind of got rid of the strict scrutiny test with respect to free exercise clause claims. Strict scrutiny remains with regard to RFRA, but not with the free exercise claims. And Smith remains good law. Every now and then, the justices talk about getting rid of Smith, but they haven't done so yet. Under Smith, if a government burdens religion as the incidental effect of a policy that is neutral with regard to religion and generally applicable across religious and secular contexts, that's not a First Amendment violation. That's not a Free Exercise Clause violation. But if the policy of the governments is not neutral, it does seem to target religion somehow, or it doesn't apply generally to everybody, religious and secular alike, well, then we're back to strict scrutiny. So what did the Knights argue in this context, Kelsey? What was their Free Exercise Clause argument?
My best understanding is that they felt like the exceptions that were named in the policy did not really make logical sense, and in that way could be like fought against. That, wait, why would religion end up on the outs? Because what is linking the things that are allowed to still take place in the cemetery? So I will be totally clear. I'm with you in that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act formula makes more sense to me. Okay, yes, you could sort of go through the steps, but I think that for this other claim, the First Amendment claim, they were hinging it on the fact that it didn't make sense to them that religion needs to be among the outcasts, that there was nothing that was unique about religion that it shared with these other problematic events.
Yeah, I see that. When I think I read through their paper, their letter, and they seem to say, well, look, you have this exception for commemorative events, and so it's not general. But to be fair to the Park Service, the exception is for, quote, official commemorative events. And the Knights of Columbus are not part of the Park Service, and so they are another group coming on. And so you could say that's kind of an apples and oranges thing. It's just like a city can put up a Ten Commandments monument in the park in certain circumstances, but that doesn't mean they have to invite everybody in to put up whatever monuments they want in the park. I mean, that is the city speaking, and here I think it would be okay. These are official events. What do you think, Kelsey?
Well, what has come to my mind in thinking deeply about this case in preparation for our conversation is that I actually have a lot of sympathy for the park officials, where they would say, okay, sure, we know what the Knights of Columbus are up to. They've done it for several years, but perhaps there was concern nationally about what it means to allow one religious event and then allow hundreds of religious events. So it's back to that old slippery slope that comes up in a lot of religious freedom rulings over time. I know there are concerns about officials approaching religion that way, but I assume that that is part of what fed into this policy, is that they didn't make the policy with the Knights of Columbus Mass in mind. They made it thinking, what sorts of wild faith-related events are we going to get requests for?
Sure. And this is what the administrator always worries about, right? If I let you do it, I have to let everybody do it. And so, I mean, that goes for deans. Law school dean. If you're listening to this, dean, this is exactly the thing, right? I mean, I let you do it, I've got to let everybody do it. And so, I guess that's part of it. Now, you said actually, I think when we were talking before we started recording, that this all changed in 2022. That the Park Service changed all that, and so I just want to ask, did they have some other altercation at some other cemetery that made them think about this? Or was this just they just came up with this one day when they were thinking about the regs?
It was unclear to me, and it was unclear to the attorneys I spoke to, because, like I said, the official response at that point of the event permit denial was just sort of mumble, 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 demonstration, mumble. Like it wasn't spelled out clearly. Okay, here's exactly what we're concerned about. But there was certainly confusion even within the Park Service, because another interesting detail that came out was that when the Petersburg Knights had been stopped from hosting the event in 2023, there were Knights in Andersonville, Georgia, who held essentially the same event in
which is another Civil War cemetery, I think.
yes, yes, that held essentially the same event in their cemetery, which is affiliated with the National Park Service, and had no problem whatsoever getting the permit. So clearly there was confusion within the National Park Service, not just among the Knights.
Now, another factor in free exercise clause jurisprudence is whether the government has somehow suggested a hostility to religion, that, like, this is, we're targeting you. This comes up in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, which the listeners will know about. Kelsey, was there any indication of that here? I mean, they do say you're a religious ceremony, we can't let you in. But did you get any idea that this was hostility to the Knights as a religious group?
No, I felt again that it was more about the Knights being frustrated that they weren't getting a clear answer, not that the answer had been hostile in some way.
I see. Okay, so that wasn't going to help too much. Anyway, so Kelsey, the good news is that the parties worked all this out. So how did they work it out? What are the terms of the settlement?
Yes, so here's the timeline. A couple weeks ahead of Memorial Day, there's this official legal letter that says, hey, we're upset about this. And again, this is after the 2023 event had been turned down. Now the 2024 event has been turned down. This year, they're finally going to take action. Here's our legal letter. It outlines their concerns about, based on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and the First Amendment. And I thought at that point, okay, we'll see what the National Park Service has to say for itself. Maybe officials will just say, oh gosh, like, we don't want this to be a lawsuit. We're going to back down. Here's your permit. But in fact, they doubled down. They did not immediately issue the permit. So that's where it became a lawsuit, a request for a temporary restraining order in order for the Knights to be able to hold their service with the days ticking down until Memorial Day. And then I believe it was about 24 or 48 hours after that the lawsuit had been formally filed that suddenly there was a press release in my inbox that said, oh, we've worked this out, we've resolved our issues, the lawsuit is dropped, we're going to be able to hold this event. The best I could gather, I mean, of course you could say, okay, their argument must have been pretty strong, but I think another very key detail is that they had high profile Virginia leaders on their side. The governor of Virginia, the attorney general in Virginia, these folks were tweeting about the situation, saying, we're so glad that this got worked out. So they're the types of leaders who would be able to pull some pretty important strings to make sure that this situation got resolved in time for Memorial Day.
That's interesting. And, I've talked to lawyers who specialize in religious liberty work. And by the way, that's a whole practice area, which I never knew about before I started teaching in this area. There are law firms that represent clients in this area. And they always say that the best way to get this resolved is somehow through somebody on the inside, through somebody who can actually get your message across to the government and convince them this is just not worth going through. It's not through litigation. It's through this other kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, soft power. I guess depending on your side of things, you might say inappropriate interference, but it's that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree from all sorts of cases that I've covered. The one that comes to my mind has to do with Sikhs in the military. So, folks that are wanting to maintain a beard or wear a turban or carry articles of faith when they're serving in the military. And when I've done interviews along those lines, there are certainly lawsuits that have come up and gained important victories for people of faith in the military. But they always talk about trying to build relationships with higher ups and meet face to face with people and explain why this is important. And so that really came out in this case as well. Hey, here's what we're up to. I don't understand why this has to escalate to a lawsuit. Is there anything you can do to help us? And it seems like that all came to this end.
Yeah, and that's what these lawyers tell me. As I say, depending on what side of things you're on, I mean, you might think, well, that's just great. That's how democracy works. And, you might think, on the other hand, that the Knights of Columbus are okay. They're well connected and it can work for them. But if I were some other group, maybe the governor wouldn't call up the Park Service. And that's an issue for another podcast too. Anyway, Kelsey, look, you cover religion in America, and that allows you to see trends that develop. What do you think is the significance of this dispute? Does it reflect something about religion in America today? And why did you decide to write about it?
It brings to my mind that phrase that you shouldn't discuss religion and politics in polite company. I'll explain why that might not make sense. But basically, I think people get nervous about discussing religion and politics around the dinner table because it makes people sort of seize up, like get nervous. Oh no, am I going to offend someone? Oh no, this isn't safe territory anymore. And it feels like a situation where the request for the event would cross someone's desk and it would be like alarm bells ringing for them. Oh no, like this is faith related. What should I do? Okay, well, our policy says that there aren't meant to be religious events in the cemetery, so probably best to say no. Okay, I'm going to say no. Speaking of past Supreme Court cases, do you remember the Boston case about the Christian flag?
Oh yeah,
And
shirtless.
that was what this felt like. I had something similar when I was reading through that case where it just felt like the person in charge of approving these event and flag requests just panicked in the moment, like, whoa, no, what is religion doing here? So I think we're going to have more and more of these conflicts as people become less comfortable in religious settings, as fewer Americans are engaged with organized religion, because that just increases the odds that someone has a natural discomfort with this topic. Again, this is more of my personal assumptions about the situation and reaction to it, and what I've gathered from covering religion and religious freedom, talking to people about these topics, is just that we're becoming more uncomfortable with religion, not less.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the things that I write about is the rise of the nuns and how so many people are checking out of organized religion. And there's a colleague of mine, a law professor at St. Thomas University of Minnesota called Greg Sisk, who's written about this too. And Greg once said to me, well, the nuns, they just kind of check out and they're not, they don't really care about these public religious displays. It's just not, they're not into it, but they're not going to really get that upset about it. But what you're saying actually is that perhaps, or what I'm gathering from you is perhaps, in fact, that's not the case, that these things which we think of as, sort of, we're not really interested in this. It's, who cares? You want to do something on public property. It doesn't really matter. Maybe they are going to be increasingly controversial.
Maybe it passes over you on a typical day if you're going about your life. Like if you walked past the service taking place on Memorial Day, you wouldn't suddenly say, "Oh no, that's religion on government owned property. Like I must do something about this." I think that it's totally fair to say that a religious nun would be pretty mellow overall. But maybe once a religious nun gets in a bureaucratic type position where they're having to sort out and worry about potential conflict or backlash to the decisions they make, that's where maybe they will be missing some important context when making decisions. I think about that with that Bladensburg Cross case, where if you drove by that big cross every day, it might not even register to you as a cross. If you know the history of past wars and the way that religion brought not just individuals comfort, but sort of the country as a whole comfort during these conflicts, you might not really worry about the fact that the government was keeping up a huge cross-shaped statue. But if you were missing that context, if you had no sort of childhood connection to that same sort of faith-based comfort, that's where you might start to be like, well, doesn't seem fair, or this seems
Yeah,
inappropriate. Wait a second, what's going on?
that's a great point. And maybe next year, Kelsey, we'll come back and you'll talk, because I'm thinking now maybe some group, now that this is a public controversy, some group's going to see this like some secularist group or some other group. We want to do something too, right? And so if the Park Service lets the Knights of Columbus do it, then why can't you let other groups come in and do it too? Because now this has become a really public thing. It's become a controversy. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, that's what we are seeing with holiday displays. When there is a display from the Satanic Temple, for example,
Yeah.
and it's like we have to welcome all comers, and then the fight just continues instead of something being resolved. So I'm sure that that's part of what was going on with the National Park Service, is that they didn't want to open the door to like, oh no, we're going to have tens of thousands of future requests that all raise our blood pressure a little bit.
Right.
So that's where you could be thankful that the Knights were able to hold the service on Memorial Day, but you might also say, oh, I wish this could have gotten worked out a little more a little more deeply. Like, okay, we know now how to apply RFRA to this situation, or we know now what the First Amendment guarantees here, because it remains a little bit up in the air because of how quickly the situation resolved itself.
Yeah, really fascinating. But it gives both you and me a job, right, Kelsey? Because we can talk about this stuff and do podcasts and teach about it and write about it. So, well, Kelsey, thank you so much for coming back. Let's have you come back again. This has been a wonderful conversation. But for now, that's been another episode of Legal Spirits, which is the podcast series of the Mattone Center for Law and Religion at St. John's Law School in New York. If you like the content, please subscribe so you can be notified as new content becomes available. But that's it for now. See you next time.